Absolutely. And good morning and very warm greetings to all of you who joined us for this discussion on very interesting and important topic nowadays. And we have an excellent panel of knowledgeable speakers selected for you. And I hope that the next hour will be, of course, very intense and then also interesting discussion ahead of us. And obviously, Ukraine is now on the international agenda because of different reasons. And we, as good friends of Ukraine, would like to see Ukraine mentioned in the news, of course, in positive ways, not in the negative or tensions ways as we see it now. But I think that international attention to the country we support and to the country we admire is very much needed. And I think this discussion is organized at the right time. Just to remind you that this discussion is organized in the framework of the Rio Conference dialogue in cooperation with the Arseniy Yannitsyuk Open Ukrainian Foundation, and the discussion is organized by the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. And as mentioned before, we have an excellent panel of various speakers, both from Riga, Latvia, and Kyiv, Ukraine. And without further ado, of course, I would like to introduce the first speaker, and she will be Dr. Oksana Monchulenko, Program Manager of the Arseniy Yannitsyuk Open Ukraine Foundation. And Oksana, are you with us?
Yes.
Good morning, very warm morning to Kyiv. And of course, we watch all the news with kind of, tensions, and situation develops by not every minute, but still by every hour or by every day. And of course, we are very much eager to learn what expectations might Ukrainians have towards your partners, towards your allies in the West during this crisis and during this escalation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here at this panel and this discussion. And first of all, I would like to start with a few remarks about the history of Ukrainian-NATO relationship, because it's almost 3 decades of a fruitful cooperation. So let's go back to 1994. When Ukraine joined the Partnership for Peace program, and it was a big start for our relations. Then after that, in 1997, Ukraine signed the Charter on Distinctive Partnership, and followed that in Kyiv was established NATO Information and Documentation Center, who is a big partner to Open Ukraine Foundation. And I think that the cooperation between NATO and Ukraine is mutually beneficial, because Ukraine also contributed a lot to NATO-led operations, missions, and joint exercises with different allies and partners. After 2014, the cooperation obviously intensified in response to Russia's aggression, and NATO has reinforced its support for capability development in Ukraine and capacity building. Also, in 2017, Ukrainian parliament adopted legislation reinstating membership in NATO as a strategic foreign and security policy objective. We can see during this period, especially after 2014, a huge amount of NATO political support to Ukraine. But also I would like to mention that NATO stepped up its practical assistance to Ukraine in 2020. So it was last year, Ukraine became one of 6 enhanced opportunity partners. And I think it was a big signal for Ukraine. It was Ukrainian efforts were recognized, and we received a huge boost towards our membership in NATO aspirations. But what is worth mentioning in this framework that now Ukraine has to step up its own game and has to do its own homework to keep showing that we are willing to do, and we are doing, and we are keeping to remove all the barriers and obstacles that are between us and NATO membership. Also, that a lot of things were done during these years, and I would like to mention that last year, for the first time, the mechanism of introduction of military standards in Ukraine were systematized and defined, and the spheres of responsibility between subject of standardization were divided. In terms of quantitative indicators, as of this year, Ukraine has implemented a total of 292 NATO standards and guidelines. And if we look at the percentage, it's 19%. About of 19%, but comparing to other countries such as Montenegro, Albania, or Northern Macedonia, this percentage is looking pretty okay. It shows that Ukraine is on track toward its goals. But yes, of course, a lot of things has to be done. A lot of things still needs to be implemented. What needs to be done? I would like to highlight a few crucial moments, like inter-parliamentary cooperation, especially between Ukrainian Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, lawmaking process in Ukraine, and also the parliamentary control of the executive branch in Ukraine over adherence to the criteria that the alliance poses and sets for the candidates for future NATO accession. Beyond that, we all know a lot of people still mistakenly think that NATO is only about transformation of the defense and security sector, but it's not only about that. It also democratic changes, rule of law, efficient anti-corruption policies, and we do hear a lot from our partners and allies that Ukraine needs to step up its game fighting corruption. And that's what we need also to focus on. And we should also remember that when Ukraine is a huge benefit to NATO, because over the past years, especially 7 last years with the Russian aggression, Ukraine has paid a heavy price, and Ukraine has shown that it's capable of defending itself. It's capable of adopting necessary laws and reforms to become a crucial partner to NATO countries. That's what I wanted to highlight at this point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Oksana. Дуже дякую. Another speaker we have with us this morning is Professor Nato who is also a chairwoman of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization. And I would like to address to her a question of Ukrainian aspirations towards the membership in EU and NATO in the framework of current international relations. Janetta, what do you think? Is it the right time for the West to accept Ukrainian aspirations, joining those alliances and unions? Or how would you assess the current situation in the international relations? Janetta?
Yeah, thank you, Dmitry, very much. And thank you for all participants who agreed to join the discussion. I would like to start with a very short announcement that this discussion is based on a policy brief which is produced by Oksana and her colleague Ramina, and this policy brief on Ukraine's aspirations in the security sector after new administration in US is now available on the webpage of Latvian Transatlantic Organization, and everybody is invited to read this policy paper. Coming back, Dmitry, to your question, actually, Ukraine's aspirations have been already admitted by both organizations, by the EU and NATO. But I think that today or these days, we are living in a very complex international environment, which probably makes those aspirations very complicated as well. So first of all, we are seeing the concentration of Russian troops at the Ukraine's border. There is ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Part of the country is annexed by Russia. There is a tension, put it mildly, between the United States and Russia, and those two countries are very decisive for Ukraine's security landscape. And I could continue more and more and more. But actually, if I'm thinking about what is the present state in security and defense sector in Ukraine, then I actually could come back to more domestic developments in Ukraine, because Russia's aspirations is not a big surprise. And we see that the international community actually reacts very timely, sufficiently loudly. But the question is to what extent Ukraine itself can manage this situation in short, mid, and long-term perspective. And here, by the way, Ukraine's cooperation with the EU and NATO is a key, because if we are looking at the progress of Ukraine's reform starting from 2014, then there are very long list of achievements Ukraine can be proud of, and also international donors and partners could be proud of. This list is very long. But then, on the other hand, there are still some question marks pending, and those question marks are very bold. So I think that it already goes like mantra, fight against corruption. So it's not only international community which would like to see more decisive steps taken, but it's also Ukrainian society which is demanding more decisive political commitments, more decisive political steps to be taken. Another point which I wanted to mention is that actually there are different levels of expectations on both sides. I mean, Ukraine and the EU and NATO. And quite clearly and quite understandably and with a lot of justification, Ukraine wants to get membership in those both organizations. And as you know, the Baltic states are very supportive in this aspiration. But if we look at the EU and NATO, then actually those organizations are not keen to accept Ukraine as a member state, but would like to see more sufficient, more visible, more goal-oriented reforms to put in place. So there was a mismatch. What one organization would like to see from Ukraine and what Ukraine wants to see from organization. I'm not going to talk about NATO because Oksana already covered this issue and also Vineta will talk about that. I would like just very shortly mention that the EU also has contributed to Ukraine's security and stability quite sufficiently. If we look at EU's advisory mission, which at the very start was performing, to put it mildly, very modestly, it's catching up and putting forward more and more important incentives. I would mention only one. So there are those EU's advisory missions mobile units and also their branches in several parts of Ukraine. One could say, oh, what a big deal. The big deal is, if you look at what are those decisive institutions and politicians who are perceived by Ukrainian society as contributing to reforms, then actually it's Mr. Yatsenyuk. So I'm not mentioning his name because Oksana is representing it's his organization, but you can actually go to Razumkova Center and look at public opinion poll results. So people asked who are the most decisive, who pushed reforms forward. It was Yatsenyuk. These were a couple of radars, but what was surprising is that one of the lowest participants in pushing reforms forward were municipalities. And what EU's advisory mission is, it builds trust between police and community. It works a lot with community initiatives, with community involvement in security and safety issues. So therefore, even if Ukraine wanted to see from this advisory mission more decisive, more hard security issues to be addressed, in the end, it fills those gaps, which probably, because of different reasons, financial, human, political, whatever, have been probably pushed somewhere in the drawer or put as a second or the third rank issues. So therefore, there are sufficient initiatives on EU side, but whether they will be decisive in the future, I still put a big question mark. And probably I will stop here and we'll continue when we will have the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Thank you very much for this overview. And you mentioned one of the important keywords, actually, successful reforms and visible reforms, tangible reforms seen by the Ukrainian citizens, and especially not at the national but at the community level. So it's my firm belief that national resilience can be structured on a bottom-up approach. So basically, it starts with strong communities who develop its security and safety on the ground. And that's a good opportunity to introduce the next speaker, who is the Latvian ambassador to Ukraine, Juris Poikans. And I think there is no region left in Ukraine unvisited by Juris. So I think, Juris, you have been on the ground in different regions, in different communities. So you have seen those results of successful or maybe not so successful reforms. And to be in the West, I mean, in the European Union and in NATO, still are referring or kind of even demanding from the Ukrainian government continue with these reforms, because it is bringing us closer together and bringing Ukraine closer to this membership. So what is your assessment? How our reforms are going, and what would be your advice to Ukrainian society and Ukrainian citizens in terms of different reforms?
Dmitry, great to see you. Great to see you all. Let me make some statements, and I agree with everything what was said already by Oksana, by Janeta. I think Ukraine is facing three big tasks, which from my point of view, all are very important. The first, we already discussed security. I don't want overestimate or underestimate the Russian challenge, but I think the threat is real. And if Mr. Biden's phone call yesterday reduce the tensions, I think this is a very important signal, but let's not fool ourselves. These differences between Ukraine and Russia are not of tactical, but of strategic nature. And as long as Kremlin's aim is to undermine Ukraine's independence, there will always be threat to Ukraine. That's why security issues is something the Ukrainian government will need to focus on its focuses. The second is reforms, you already touched upon, because Ukraine depends on the international community. It depends on the International Monetary Fund, it depends on the European Union, and if Ukraine's reforms are successful, Ukraine gets close relationship with the European Union. If they are not successful, Ukraine is left alone. And the third, I think, big challenge is for Ukraine. It's what you discussed, what we have discussed with you in the past. It's resilience of the society, which means strong communities, but it means also continuously building a political nation. I hear many times that after 2014, the Ukrainian society is different. I agree it's different. But when you look at the results of local government elections last year, you see that people are still very often approaching very sensitive and important issues from different perspectives. So the question of building a uniform society from Uzhhorod and Mariupol still remains a very important task. So you have these three very big tasks, and I think the European Union and NATO are instrumental in tackling all these challenges without any doubts. So I agree with Janeta, what she was saying, that there are different expectations from both sides. The European Union wants to focus on the implementation of the association agreement, seeing this at this moment as the key framework document in relations between the European Union and Ukraine. Ukraine wants to have a clear perspective that we are expected as a member of the European Union and NATO. So in a way, these are two exclusive approaches. My own feeling, being here in Ukraine, there are some reforms which are, from my point of view, have developed very successfully. And one is definitely decentralization. Because what you see in Ukraine's regions, in one point, it's good that actually local authorities were very much re-elected in Ukraine. It means you have more money, people trust you. By the way, the situation is very similar in Latvia. You have mayors who are staying for 20, 25 years. It means that people in general are satisfied with your work. I think a lot has been done in the field of security and defense reform. Because if you compare the Ukrainian armed forces in 2014 and you compare the Ukrainian armed forces today, and its civilian control over defense, so I think it has moved pretty well. The key stumbling block, which from my point of view is the key challenge in Ukraine, it's justice reform. And we were with Vineta last week, having one joint TV interview, and I explained to my Ukrainian friends that membership action plan in NATO, it's not only about politics or defense, it's about ethnic minorities, it's about justice reform. And as long as foreign investors will not feel safe on the territory of Ukraine, it's extremely difficult to expect reciprocity from the side of the European partners. And what Janeta was saying, I believe all Ukrainians expect justice as well. So it's not only about Germany, France, or Latvia, it's only about Ukrainians as well. So we can definitely identify progress in some areas, but I think the key issue which still remains, and I think all reforms depend whether you have reasonably functioning justice system. So, and my last point is, I don't like this debate whether Ukraine has European perspective or not. Article 49 definitely tells that Ukraine has European perspective, but it will not be explicitly stated by the European Union now. So we come to the question of managing expectations. I believe it's a bit wrong before every EU or NATO summit immediately raise expectations that we need MAP, we need NATO because we deserve it. Maybe I'm speaking as a Protestant person. I believe everything depends on hard work at the end. You complete something, you go to Brussels, Berlin, and Paris and ask for something more. So I believe here we must find the right model. I wouldn't be against explicitly mentioning the European perspective or even granting membership action plan, but it's definitely because we would speak here about the future. It would definitely stimulate reforms. But at the end of the day, it's homework Ukraine should be doing. And more successful Ukraine be in its homework, I believe more political signals we will be able to listen from Brussels and other EU and NATO member states. So I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Juris, and I totally agree with you that hard work is a very important basis for success, and that's actually well, our Baltic experience tell us that that was our way towards NATO and towards membership in the European Union, making very dramatic reforms in all sectors, basically, during 10 or 15 years. Thank you very much, Juris, again. Our next speaker will be Vineta Kleine, who is Director of NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kyiv. And Vineta, your organization, of course, is looked with, again, different aspirations or different expectations. So one might see in NATO kind of transformational power for various changes and reforms in security and defense area, but other groups might see in NATO's membership kind of symbolic signal for Ukraine and for its citizens, as actually several speakers, Juris and Janeta, mentioned before, that NATO is not just a military alliance, it has a lot of different pillars, and membership action plan really does look at different domestic policies as well. So what is your assessment I would ask, of course, a blunt question. How ready is Ukraine for joining NATO, or NATO? Is NATO a transformational power for Ukraine at this moment?
Dmitris, thank you, and good morning, colleagues. Indeed, it's a pleasure to join you this very timely discussion on the reform process in Ukraine, because Ukraine's accession to NATO and Ukraine's membership into NATO is very connected, and straightforward connected with the ongoing reforms and the reform process. And that's why today, a couple of next minutes, I will devote to outlining the key issues related to security and defense sector transformations. And the Ukrainian security and defense sector has experienced significant transformation aimed at bringing it in line with NATO principles and best practice. And over the past couple of years, allies have noted progress in a number of areas, and I will touch some of them. And this progress includes defense planning, command and control system development, non-commissioned officer corps development, and professional military education. And what is very important, that the adoption of the law on national security was a milestone for the security and defense sector of Ukraine. And particularly important are the provisions of the law on national security on civilian control and democratic oversight over the security and defense sector. Furthermore, the adoption of the law on defense procurement is also noted as a positive development. And last year, Ukraine adopted a new law on intelligence, which is seen as an important step towards ensuring that the services work with greater accountability and transparency. And NATO advisors welcomed also the adoption of the new national security strategy last year in September. You see all the whole package, you know, of the laws that have been recently also adapted. And we believe that the adoption of the national security strategy will help guide security and defense sector reform. Moreover, we believe that the new military security strategy will contribute to the reform process of Ukraine's defense sector, because the strategy is also aimed at establishing a well-prepared and well-resourced comprehensive defense in Ukraine. Also, we will welcome the approval of the draft law on the security service of Ukraine in its first reading, and we hope that further work on the draft law will help align it even more closely with Euro-Atlantic principles and best practice. And NATO also hopes that intensive work on the draft law on state secrets and management of classified information will begin soon, because the reform of the security service and legislative progress regarding the protection of classified information will help Ukraine facilitate closer intelligence cooperation with allies. To ensure reform movement, further prioritization and clear articulation of strategic goals across the defense and security sector will be key. And following the adoption of the legislative framework, a challenging implementation process of reform goals starts. So first adoption and then implementation. And it should be very much result-oriented and very much practical. And in that regard, the annual national program remains as key instrument for Ukraine to implement reforms required to progress on the Euro-Atlantic path. And we share NATO assessment of the reform progress at the political level annually. We do it annually. And that we do in the ANP assessment document. And at the same time, our advisors provide that feedback to the Ukrainian counterparts on the daily basis. And our experts agree that the annual national program has improved year after year in terms of formulating reforms, tasks, and priorities. And we strongly believe that Ukraine needs to continue to focus on domestic reform, that Ukraine needs to consolidate its democratic institutions, that Ukraine needs to strengthen the rule of law, to fight corruption, and that Ukraine needs also to strengthen its security and defense sector in line with Euro-Atlantic principles and best practice. And in this regard, NATO welcomes the clear message from Prime Minister Shmyhal on the need to continue the reform process, to make sure that Ukraine has civilian control over its security and defense institutions, and including the armed forces and security service. And NATO will continue to stand by Ukraine and look for opportunities to assist, to provide advice, and work together. Thank you, Dmitry.
Thank you very much, Vineta. And of course, NATO support is very strong. It was expressed on the highest political level just recent days, but I'm very grateful to you for listening actually the instrumental reforms which would be very beneficial for Ukrainian defense and security sector. And I think the awareness on reforms progress maybe is not so high in Ukraine because there are so many reforms are going on, and let's say even a regular citizen being a pro-Western regular citizen in Ukraine might not be quite aware of the kind of successful steps already done by Ukrainian authorities, and it's very good to have the full list, and we can see that that progress is ongoing. And thank you for updating us on that. And now I would like to give a floor for short comment for another ambassador who joined us from Riga, and he's a Ukrainian ambassador to Latvia, Mr. Alexander Mishenko. And ambassador, I can imagine that being ambassador in a kind of heart of the Baltics, Latvia, a country which is very friendly to Ukraine, so you don't have to convince Latvians in need of supporting Ukraine. But what is your take? What kind of small country within the European Union or NATO, as Latvia is, or Lithuania or Estonia, again, being very friendly and supportive to your country, what could we do else for freedom and prosperity of Ukraine?
Thank you very much for possibility to take part in this conference. I should like to thank all speakers of today's conference for a substantive discussion and pictures that gives possibility to imagine situation in whole, in Ukraine, in EU, in NATO, etc. And take in account about this title of reform, I should like to point that in July in Vilnius, it will be fourth conference for reform, and Ukraine will be ready to discuss the situation concerning situation in Ukraine concerning reform, and we pay a lot for gain all of criteria, all of necessary conditions for gain the membership in European Union and NATO also. But I should like to use words of my president just now. He stressed in Twitter that reform is our army and defense sector is good, but reform alone will not stop Russia. And I should like to confirm that said Yuris about situation in borders, that military attack from Russia is reality. It's absolutely reality now, today, or in this second. And that's why I will pay attention concerning nature of this behavior of Russia. Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, the relevant intelligence structure of Ukraine have recently provided the international community with whole information about situation in the border of Ukraine in detail. And I have also this information about the battalion, troops, militaries, guns, machine guns, tanks, etc., that concentrated in our border. That is reality. For understanding this, we need to go in past, in history. Moscow goals is obvious: to prevent the loss of its influence on Ukraine, to deprive Ukraine authority in matter of foreign policy, and to bring Ukraine into a state equal to Belarus. It's artificial state with some symbolic statehood symbols, but without any possibility to make their own foreign policy. And Ukraine is not agree for this. And now I'm absolutely sure that Kremlin evaluates Ukrainian success in the implementation of European norms and standards and Kyiv's approach to membership in the European Union and NATO as the beginning of the end of authoritarian regime of Putin, as an impetus for the real struggle of democracy in Russia, which will undoubtedly lead to the collapse of this anti-popular corrupt regime of Putin and his ally inside of Russia. That's why Putin strikes so tough for Ukraine. In matter not Ukraine, the matter is a 2 point of view, 2 pole, the democracy and the dictatorship. Putin tried to keep and to preserve the situation forever. And our task to break this, his intention to use Ukraine through military attacks to give signal for West that you have to agree with me because I am superpower. He tried to repeat situation in before Second War. If you compare situation in 1938, when Nazi Germany raised the question of dividing Czechoslovakia. And that time, it was illusion that a small sacrifice could satisfy the appetites of the blood monster Hitler. But very soon, the concession led to the everyone was so afraid a global world war. You will agree or not agree, but situation is very similar. It's the same. Putin used the same tactic as the Hitler or the Stalin. Putin raising the stakes so that the international community, in order to avoid a further military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, close eyes to the illegal occupation of Crimea, and before that a part of Georgia, and to repression against opposition within Ukraine, within Russia. That is, Putin is trying to impose the law of force on the world instead of the force of law. How Stalin did it in 1945 regarding the establishment of new world order after the end of World War II. But as history teaches, negotiation with dictatorial regime is essentially impossible. They only aggravates the problem and creates new wars and suffering for future generation. Based on what has been said, the main task now is to stop the aggression, but at the cost, not at the cost of the concessions and requests, but by depriving the Kremlin of this opportunity for any aggression against any country. This is the main task now. And my minister yesterday in Brussels gives all of detailed information about that I mentioned before for all our partners in NATO. He has meeting with State Secretary of USA and very openly inform him about situation inside Ukraine and our border also. I absolutely agree with speakers that we need to do our home task to gain map and to gain membership is NATO. But we need also understand the time now, the crucial time of Ukrainian history. Ukraine tried to do all the best to move through our tough reform, because you can see situation in Ukraine and differences between, as Yuri mentioned, between Mukachevo and Mariupol, it's artificial difficulties. We need to know the history in Soviet time, how Soviet regime demolishes our independence in Ukraine, and now we have results of this. That's why west part more close to west and east part more close to east for Russia, because it was artificially, and now Putin repeated in Crimea. He tried to expel all of our patriots. Instead, then he brings some Russians, more than 500,000 Russians come to Crimea, and artificially to change picture in Crimea. And after that, probably he will announce its readiness to organize second referendum and said, okay, if you want, we need to organize referendum, you will, okay, we will see. We will see. And they also vote for Russian membership, etc. But it's artificially. That's why talking about situation in Ukraine, talking about reform, we need to understand that Putin fight now for him personally, for his regime. Success of Ukraine is defeated Putin future. That need to remember. That's why we're very proud that now international community so loudly support us. As mentioned one speaker before, that yes, it's statements. Now it's statements, but it's very important. The statements for from all of community to Putin. He tried to undermine this unity through some proxies, through some allies, through some people who believes for Putin wisdom, etc., etc. Personally, I don't believe. For me, it's the same as we will try to ask crocodile to be vegetarian and explain him that it's good for health, good for skin. It will be very good to be vegetarian, but never crocodile will be not vegetarian. It's the same with Putin regime.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your remarks. And well, I'm sure that the era of so-called Western naivety is over. And I think Ukraine's friends and partners and allies, they have no illusions about Putin's regime being a hostile crocodile. And obviously, speaking about Ukraine's security cooperation with the West, of course, we cannot ignore another hostile player on that ground, and Russia is very aggressive, and there is no doubt that the security threat to Ukraine is both possible and plausible. And if you look at the questions already posted to the speakers, well, there are many of them, and if you allow me to group some of them into one question and address it to Janeta, perhaps. So basically, what the United States of America could do in this situation to deter Russia from intensifying the conflict, from the escalating it on the Ukraine's border. So we spoke today about the European Union, we touched upon NATO, but I think at least looking at the questions, in many questions, the role of the United States is being raised. So Jeanette, what is your opinion? What would be your recommendation to the Biden administration at this moment?
Thank you for honoring me to give advice to Mr. Biden. First of all, I think that this question should be put in slightly wider context from my point of view, because I think that what Ukrainian ambassador to Latvia mentioned, that indeed the situation in Ukraine is very worrisome. But as you, Dmitry, said, so nobody has to be convinced what Putin is up to. So those days that Ukraine had to convince partners that what are real intentions of Russia, those days are over. So if we look again at Russia and more from defense perspective, you usually ask two questions. What about capabilities? Of course, Russia has capabilities. What about intentions? And this time we are not so clear about intentions because there could be different reasons why. It could be because of sending signals to Mr. Biden. These could be signals sent to NATO, not to enlarge, as one of the comments mentioned here in our chat box. It could be also reaction to too intensive criticism regarding Navalny. Yeah? So, and I could go more and more and more. So we are not quite clear about intentions. Therefore, instead of probably to calculate only on one intention, it's very important to strengthen cooperation across the whole spectrum of issues. If the focus will be only on defense cooperation, probably we will miscalculate. And there could be grounds for definitely causing some military tension in the East. Therefore, advice to the US would be, if I'm allowed to do that as an academic, I think the US, first of all, has to continue already ongoing cooperation in defense sector because Americans used to be very active, but political framework was lost during Trump's administration. So now it's time probably for Americans to get back also on this political narrative track, reminding that we are with you Ukrainians, we are watching what is happening there, and we are providing you resources, and I'm not talking about military tools, equipment, and so on, but we are providing you international support, which is very relevant in that particular case. But then there should be also a very strong commitment on Ukrainian side that we are delivering. And unfortunately, this message of we are delivering so far has been very quiet. I'm not saying that not delivering, definitely Ukrainians are delivering, but they are very quiet. And for instance, if Russians response to activities, reforms, and commitment in Ukraine are increase of armed forces at Ukrainian borders, I would recommend Ukrainians to place army of diplomats in Brussels and to work with those organizations, EU and NATO, and also with diplomats of all member states. It would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janetta, and very much like your statement of army of diplomats in different capitals. Indeed, international attention to Ukraine is a very hard currency these days, and we should keep it high. Oksana, I would like to turn to you now, again, grouping some questions, and your ambassador actually told us very right thing that Ukraine is facing great challenges in reforming itself while actually fighting the war against Russia, and so being at the same time, of course, it's very difficult. But nevertheless, your country is doing well, and as Janetta told us, maybe this is the question of visibility of those success stories, not that you are not delivering. Would you please elaborate on the further prospects of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic future? Because we don't want to talk only about Russia, but actually we want to focus on Ukraine's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Dmitry. I think that the prospects of Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, well, they are quite clear, because I'm sure that eventually Ukraine will fulfill its dreams and will join NATO and European Union, because we have a huge amount of support from Ukrainian people for joining these two organizations. And it's a good signal in Ukraine and for Ukrainian government and for Ukrainian partners. Of course, if we will look from another perspective, that Ukraine is very crucial to maintaining peace in the region, in the Europe, and Ukraine joining NATO is is very important for Ukraine as well, and for allies and NATO countries and Europe as a whole, to maintain peace, stability, and security. Of course, I would not put this in the framework that joining NATO and joining European Union will immediately put a stop the war in Ukraine, the conflict with Russia and the aggression. No, but the process, I mean, the joining these two organizations, it's a path towards this organization, and the result, joining them, that what is important in achieving peace as well. I think that's a huge part of this question. Of course, Ukraine membership will only, I'm sure of it, will only strengthen the alliance. Of course, it will also promote the unification of Europe as a whole, and I'm pretty sure that it will create the preconditions for the transformation of relations with Russia in the future. I would also like to say that we also hear that the future of Euro-Atlantic perspectives of Ukraine sometimes are on hold because Russia has some kind of a veto on joining Ukraine NATO, let's say. And I would like to quote Secretary General, NATO Secretary General yesterday. He received the same question, and he said that, well, it's up to the alliance to decide, and that the door is always open for Ukraine, and Ukraine can decide when to apply for the membership, and only for the alliance is to decide. We have to go away from this practice when some authoritarian country pulls the strings and says what to do or not to do. So I think that's the answer, and that's what we should focus on, because that's not how it is. For Ukraine is to do its homework, to implement reforms, not only to implement, but to effectively implement the reforms, to work with these allies and partners towards its goal. And then it's for the partners and allies to decide whether Ukraine is ready or not to become a member of NATO and the European Union. So I think that should be the focus on Ukrainian government and of Ukrainians and Ukraine as a country.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you very much for your statement. And I would like to turn back to Yuris, again, speaking about different reforms. And Yuris, you mentioned that, of course, rule of law is very important to potential investors. So basically, people who have money and looking places to invest in, they should feel being safe and being not threatened and being confident in the rule of law. And in that regard, I'm very convinced that you are very busy in attracting Latvian investors to Ukraine and visiting different places. So have you seen any progress in that regard? I mean, how attractive Ukraine is to Latvia or to the West in general in terms of investment? Because real investment means actually tangible results for citizens on the ground, and then they can see it, and then they can actually see the value of being part of the European system. Thank you.
I definitely see positive dynamics. Let's start with that. And obviously, this is a traditional market for us, Ukraine. It's one of top 20 trade partners. And we have had several business cases here, maybe difficult cases, but I think that at the end of the day, every EU embassy is struggling. And it's important that these issues are being resolved. When it comes to Latvia, we have had two sensitive cases. And I told it yesterday to the Prosecutor General of Ukraine that both these two cases were solved. It means it takes time, it takes patience, it takes a lot of political activities, but it's working. So we cannot say that there is no progress. And we definitely can note, as I mentioned, some positive dynamics. We see that, for example, the Supreme Court is currently being mentioned as one of the most effective institutions. What I'm always telling to my specifically Western colleagues, if you look at the experience of the Baltic states or at the experience of Visegrad states, our heritage, we inherited after the Soviet Union, let's say it was less complex than Ukraine did it. So Ukraine inherited much more difficult heritage at the end of the day. So those issues we were able to resolve at the beginning of 90s. Let's say we already in 1985, we were speaking about joining EU and NATO in our foreign policy concept. Let's say Ukraine is lagging behind some 20 years. So as a result, we are facing the same problems, but at the same time, the heritage was more difficult, and it will take more time also in case of Ukraine. That's why what we need in Ukraine, this is, I would call it strategic patience. Obviously, the European Union and NATO states and Americans are closely following what's happening in the field of justice reform, in the field of security reform, and I think this is very good. We received a lot of advice and assistance and also pressure, for example, from the Nordic states, and we were carefully listening what they were advising to us. We do not have a perfect system. I think Ukrainians are slowly moving. So my overall feeling is Ukraine is on the right direction. And specifically when we look at business relations, another issue what Ukraine has, and it must face it, it's the issue of the image. You know, today when you say Ukraine, you immediately think about the war and you think about, let's say, corruption. So you would ask ordinary Latvian, Estonian, or Pole. So this is something where Ukraine should work more. Looking from Kyiv's perspective, let's say the picture is neither black nor white. And I would say that slowly, but the ship under the name of Ukraine is moving forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the key issue is not only to add some cases, but I can really say that those cases we have been able to resolve.
Thank you very much, Juris, and I obviously like your statement about strategic patience, and I think it is a key issue, and obviously those complex reforms are going to deliver in some times, not immediately, and Ukrainian citizens obviously are doing well, but they need more time for that. And in terms of security cooperation with NATO, obviously nothing is going to happen overnight, but as Nato already listed, there are several reforms ongoing there. And Nato, back to you with the last question, perhaps looking at the watch. I would like to ask about actually image. Juris touched upon the Ukraine's image within the European Union and NATO, but what about NATO image in Ukraine? I mean, it might be obviously associated just with the military equipment and guns, but obviously NATO is not just about it. Or do you see a positive dynamics on NATO's image in Ukraine? Vineta, please.
Yes, Dimitris, thank you for the question. So definitely, so over a couple of years, so and actually since 2014, we have seen, I would say, fundamental, significant change in Ukrainians' understanding or approach towards NATO. And we have seen increase in support of the country joining the alliance. And this is also what we do together with the NATO Information Documentation Center, that does together with civil society, with non-governmental organizations, to increase awareness of NATO in the country. And what I always do, I always underline that NATO, it's both, it's political and military organization. First, it comes with political aspects, so and it's military, because there is still this perception that NATO is just purely a military organization, and that is what we do, and that is what we also during the lockdown, what we can do, we reach out also to students. So we are holding lots of lectures for university students in order to explain what are NATO values, what are NATO principles, engagements, because NATO, it's not just about this military aspect. It's, we are also dealing with a full set of other issues. So, and this support for the NATO, it's very it's increasing, and it's a positive sign. And also one thing, it's very actual now as a membership action plan. So it's on the top of Ukraine's agenda. But what we also do, we explain that it's not only about countries' military capabilities. But it's this integration, NATO integration, it's a complex process, and it's based on certain criteria, among which are a functioning democratic political system, which is based on a market economy. It's very important. It's about as a fair treatment of minority populations. It's about a commitment to the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And it's about a commitment to democratic civil-military relations. And it's about the ability and willingness to make a military contribution to NATO-led missions operations. So we need to keep in mind, that it's indeed, it's a complex process and a complex approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vineta, and thank you very much for all speakers today, and for all those who watched us and followed our discussions, and for obviously those active people who posted the questions. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't address all of them, but nevertheless, I think the bottom line of today's discussion, that international attention and actually the Western solidarity has a deterring effect on Putin's Russia. And obviously, Ukraine has a lot of friends and supporters in the Baltics and across the world, and that we have to work together in helping Ukraine in its reforms and transformation processes, which is very much expected and allied with its aspirations towards the European Union and NATO. Again, thank you very much for being with us. It was a very interesting hour of discussion, and let's hope that the spring will be very peaceful. Take care and goodbye.